Okay, our review questions that we had for Chapter 4, which is about body membranes. The first one, what is the only dry membrane? That should be the cutaneous membrane, also known as the skin. The skin is considered the only dry membrane. Number two, body membranes are classified as one of two types based on whether they are composed of epithelial tissue or connective tissue. Most of the membranes are epithelial tissue. Cutaneous, mucus, and serous are epithelial membranes. The only connective tissue membrane that we have is the synovial membrane, which you can find in joint cavities. Number three, mucous membranes line body cavities that are open to the exterior. Number four, serous membranes line body cavities that are closed to the exterior. Number five, the outside of the stomach would have a blank membrane, while the inside of the stomach would have a blank membrane. So if you were looking at the stomach as it sits inside your body, lining the outside of the stomach, you would have a serous membrane. Now, serous membranes always come in two layers. There's a visceral layer and there's a parietal layer. The layer that's actually covering the stomach on the outside of it would be the visceral serous membrane. And then the abdominal cavity would be lined by the parietal serous membrane. Now, the other part of this number five question says the inside of the stomach. So if you followed from your mouth down into your stomach, the inside lining of the stomach would have a mucous membrane. So the first one should be serous membrane. The second one should be mucous membrane for number five. Number six, the epidermis is made up of what kind of tissue? Stratified squamous. Number seven, the dermis is made up of dense connective tissue. Number eight, the stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin, which is on your hands, the palms of your hands, and the soles of your feet. So stratum lucidum is that extra layer of epidermis that we have on the thick parts of our skin, on the palms of our hands and on the soles of our feet. So it is not in other places on our body, like on our arm, the epidermis there only has 4 layers, but on our hands, the epidermis has 5 layers. Okay, remember from the surface going deep into ultimately the dermis, ending up at the dermis, you have stratum corneum, lucidum, then you have granulosum, then you have spinosum, and then you have basale, are those 5 layers. Now, if we're talking about some other part of the skin, it only has 4 layers and we skip the stratum lucidum. Number 9, what is keratin with a K and what does it do? Keratin is a protein that is produced by our epidermis or within our epidermis, and it is a waterproofing protein and it sort of toughens those skin cells that are those squished flat cells that make up our epidermis. So keratin is a hard waterproof protein that provides some strength to our epidermal layers. Number 10, what is the only actively mitotic layer of the epidermis? The very bottom layer, stratum basale, is the only actively mitotic layer. It is the only layer where mitosis is happening and the cells are dividing. And all of the cells at the top in the stratum corneum that are flaking off are replaced by the cells from the stratum basale as they move up the layers. So those stratum basale cells are going to move up from that bottom layer of the epidermis and work their way towards the top, and they're eventually going to flake off. But that is the only layer that is currently undergoing mitosis to make more cells. Number 11, what happens to skin cells as they migrate upward? Ultimately, they lose pretty much all of their organelles and they become filled with keratin. More and more keratin accumulates inside of them, and they become basically dead cells that are just full of this tough protein called keratin. They kind of become like shingles on your roof. They're hard and they're resistant to abrasion and things like that. Number 12, the amount of melanin you produce is dependent upon what two things? Melanin is one of the pigments that gives us our skin color. Melanin gives your skin a color anywhere from sort of yellow to brown to black, and it depends on your genetics and it depends on your amount of sun exposure. Number 13, skin color is determined by what 3 pigments? Well, one of them is melanin. Another one is keratin with a C, not keratin with a K, that was that waterproofing protein. Keratin with a C is a pigment, a sort of orangish, yellowish pigment that you can get by eating certain types of vegetables like carrots, for example. The last pigment that gives us our skin color, and it's particularly true for really light-skinned people, hemoglobin in your blood, because underneath your epidermis, sometimes you can see down through the epidermis into the dermis, and you see the blood vessels running through there. And so people that have rosy cheeks or sort of pinkish colored skin, they get that pigment from the hemoglobin in their blood. Number 14, collagen and elastic fibers found in the blank give skin its blank and blank. Well, collagen and elastic fibers, we're talking about connective tissue when we talk about those types of fibers. So which part of our skin is made up of connective tissue? That would be our dermis, found in the dermis, give the skin its toughness and elasticity. Collagen gives it its toughness, elastic fibers give it its elasticity. Number 15, finger-like projections of the dermis that extend into the epidermis. And these are the things that are actually responsible for our fingerprints as well, are known as dermal papillae. Dermal papillae, foldings of the dermis that push up into the epidermis. If you look on that picture of the skin, those are those things way up at the top where they've kind of peeled the epidermis back from the dermis. You see those folds that kind of go up into the epidermis. Those are the dermal papillae. Number 16, what would the skin do in response to cold temperatures? Okay, this is a very important question on the test, and you need to be able to tell me several ways that our body regulates temperature using our skin. The first one that comes to mind is sweat. When we sweat, the water on our skin evaporates, and as that water evaporates by the heat from our bodies going into that water, it's going to cause some of that heat to leave, and it's going to cool us off. So the sweat goes up from those sweat pores onto our skin. The heat from our skin makes that sweat evaporate, and then that evaporation is going to cool off our skin as some of that heat leaves. That's one way. You have to list at least two. It's a 3-point question on tomorrow's test. You need to be able to list and explain those processes. Okay, so don't just say sweating. You need to write more than that to give me a point. Okay, so how does sweat help us cool down? Well, when that water evaporates, the heat from our skin is going to leave our bodies, and it's going to help cool us down. Another way that our skin helps to regulate our temperature, a really important way, is by regulating the blood flow in the dermis. Our dermis has a supply of blood vessels, and then as you work your way up the dermis, you're going to get smaller and smaller vessels until you get to these little capillaries that are just underneath the epidermis. They have tiny little capillary loops that go up into those dermal papillae. The way that our skin helps to regulate our temperature with those blood vessels is by constricting them, making them smaller, making the openings in the blood vessels smaller when it's cold. We don't want blood flowing really close to the surface of our skin when we're cold. We want to keep our blood more towards our core so we can keep our core temperature higher and we don't freeze to death. So what happens when we're cold is the blood vessels, like think of your hands or your feet, when it gets really cold, they start to lose feeling and maybe they even turn a little bit white in color because the blood that's underneath your skin, those blood vessels start to constrict, and so you lose some blood flow to your fingers, and that's why your fingers sort of turn white. So blood vessels constrict when we're cold. When we're hot, blood vessels will dilate and they get larger, and we want more of our blood to flow underneath our skin. So then that heat from our blood can sort of radiate through the skin to the outside air. And we kind of act like a radiator when our blood vessels dilate. Sometimes our face gets kind of flushed. We get red in the face when we're exercising. We're trying to dump off some of that extra heat that our body has. Another way that our bodies regulate our temperature, or our skin helps regulate our temperature, is the erector pillae muscle. The erector pillae muscle, when we're cold, it will pull the hair follicle and it will lift the hair up so that our hair gets a little taller and there's a little bit thicker layer of air close to our skin. It's not very helpful in humans anymore because we've lost most of our body hair. But in animals, that's going to help keep them a little bit warmer in that case. So when we're cold, we start to shiver, And the shivering is how our muscles keep us warm. Our skin isn't doing that, but we get goosebumps sometimes. And those goosebumps are little dimples in our skin that form when the erector pili muscle tugs on that hair follicle and lifts the hair up. So at the same time that you get those goosebumps, your hair kind of stands on end a little bit. That is ideally supposed to kind of keep us warmer. Like I said, it doesn't help so much in humans today. At one point in time, when we did have a little bit more body hair, it was a little more useful. But it is still something that happens when we get cold, and it's another way that our skin helps to regulate our temperature. So make sure that you know at least 2 ways that our skin helps to regulate temperature, and can you explain those to me, not just name them? Number 17, the hypodermis is made mostly of adipose tissue, which is fat. Number 18, what are the differences between sebaceous and sweat glands? Sebaceous glands produce oil. They're connected to hair follicles and they secrete oil up onto the hair follicle or into the hair follicle, which runs up the hair and eventually coats the hair in oil. Our sweat glands produce sweat. Number 19, what are the functions of the oil produced by the glands within our skin? One of the things that oil does is it keeps our hair from drying out. It lubricates the skin, and it also has some properties that allow it to kill bacteria. Number 20, what are the functions of sweat produced by the glands within our skin? Sweat helps to dissipate heat and to keep us cooler. It helps to excrete wastes, and it helps to inhibit some bacterial growth. Although some bacteria like to live off of the sweat that we produce too, but it does have some antibiotic properties as well. Number 21, what causes the smell associated with sweat? That would be the bacteria that feed on that sweat. It's the bacteria that feed on the sweat from the apocrine glands, actually, rather than the eccrine glands. So number 22, what are the differences between eccrine sweat and apocrine sweat? Apocrine sweat glands are only found under your arms and in the genitals area as well. They are sweat glands that produce proteins, and they also have fatty acids in there. And the bacteria are basically feeding on those proteins and fatty acids. And as they eat those proteins and fatty acids, they're producing that smell that we associate with body odor. So the apocrine sweat glands are the ones that are giving us that body odor, and it's because of the bacteria feeding on those fatty acids and those proteins. The eccrine sweat doesn't have those, and so bacteria generally don't get anything out of the eccrine sweat. So that sweat's not the sweat that makes you stink. So the sweat that's on your arm really doesn't stink. The sweat that's under your arm does really stink. Number 23, nails are made entirely of what substance? Keratin. Again, keratin with a K, the tough waterproofing protein. Number 24, blank degree burns. You should know first, second, and third. Okay, which ones would be the entire epidermis and the upper part of the dermis? That would be second degree. First degree would be just the epidermis. Second degree is epidermis, top of the dermis. And then number 25, which degree burns just burn the epidermis? That would be first. I already said that one. The one that's would be third degree would be the whole entire skin layer, from the epidermis all the way down through the dermis. That would be a third degree burn, and that of course is the most serious. Your biggest danger, I don't have this question in there, but the biggest threat to you when you have a third degree burn would be dehydration first and foremost, because that skin is not keeping the water in, and the water evaporating from the layers of tissue underneath your skin would be the biggest risk that you have. So water loss, getting you the fluids you need, that would be kind of the first priority of the first responders when treating those burns. After they treat you for that, to make sure that you don't go low on water or undergo desiccation, would be making sure that you don't get infections. That would be the next big serious thing without having any skin from a third degree burn. Number 26, which type of skin cancer is the most dangerous? That would be malignant melanoma. Malignant means that it has moved from one place to another, or metastasized means that it's moved from one place to another. So malignant melanoma is the most dangerous type. Number 27, which is the least dangerous? That would be basal cell carcinoma. Number 28, explain how A, B, C, D, and E is used to determine if a mole is cancerous or not. A stands for asymmetrical. So if a mole does not have an equal left and right side, essentially, if you couldn't draw a line right down the middle of it and it's bigger on one side than the other, that's a sign that it could potentially be cancerous. But if it's symmetrical and you can kind of draw a line right down the middle and there's an equal left and right side, then it's not something they generally are going to be as worried about. B stands for border irregularity. Are the borders or the edges of that mole nice and smooth, or are they kind of jagged and do they sort of jut in and out in different places? If they are irregular and sort of jagged, then it might be potentially cancerous. C stands for color. One color is not something they're worried about. Lots of different kinds of colors within that mole might be something that they're concerned about. So more than one color in that mole would be concerning. D stands for diameter. If the diameter or the size of the mole is bigger than the head of an eraser on a pencil, then that could be potentially a cancerous mole. If it's smaller than the head of an eraser on a pencil, then it probably isn't. And then E stands for elevation. Elevation, if the mole is growing upward off the surface of the skin, that would also be something that could potentially be cancerous and you would maybe want to have checked out. Again, none of these things by itself is an indication that it is cancerous for sure. Largely, they're going to look at, have you noticed a change in it in the last 6 months? Is it actively growing as you can see it? Like it doesn't look like you remembered it looking. That would be something that they would definitely be interested in. Um, but they're going to look at multiple factors taken together, plus how much is that mole changing in a relatively short amount of time.